In the year 1274 BCE, two of the most powerful armies on Earth collided beside a river in what is now Syria, near a city called Kadesh. On one side stood the Egyptians, led by their famous pharaoh Ramesses II. On the other stood an empire that most people today have never heard of. An empire that fought Egypt to a standstill and walked away from that battle as an equal. When the dust settled, these two great powers eventually signed what may be the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history, a copy of which hangs today at the headquarters of the United Nations. The empire that stood toe-to-toe with mighty Egypt was the Hittites. And within a century of their greatest triumph, they would vanish so completely that for nearly 3,000 years, historians weren't even sure they had been real. For a long time, the only place the Hittites appeared was in passing mentions in the Bible as one of many peoples living in the ancient Near East. Scholars assumed they were a minor tribe, if they had existed at all. Then, a little over a century ago, archaeologists digging in central Turkey uncovered a buried capital city and tens of thousands of clay tablets written in a forgotten language. The lost empire of the Hittites came roaring back into history, and it turned out they had been one of the three superpowers of the Bronze Age world. So who were they? The Hittites built their empire in Anatolia, the high, rugged plateau of what is now Turkey. This was a harsh land of cold winters, rocky hills, and scattered river valleys, very different from the warm river plains of Egypt and Mesopotamia. From this mountainous heartland, the Hittites forged a kingdom that at its peak stretched across much of Anatolia and reached down into Syria, bringing them into direct competition with the other great powers of the age. The Hittites were an Indo-European people, meaning their language belonged to the same broad family as Greek, Latin, Persian, and most modern European tongues. In fact, the Hittite language, once those clay tablets were deciphered, turned out to be the oldest Indo-European language ever written down. That single fact made the Hittites enormously important to scholars because their tablets pushed back our knowledge of this entire language family by centuries. They wrote using cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script borrowed from Mesopotamia, but they pressed it into service for their own very different language, and they also used a separate set of picture symbols we call hieroglyphs for certain inscriptions. They built their capital at a city called Hattusa, high in the Anatolian hills, and its ruins are still impressive today. It was a fortress city protected by miles of thick stone walls, guarded by gates carved with lions and warriors, and set among steep ridges that made it hard to attack. Inside, the Hittite kings kept vast archives of clay tablets, and it is these archives that let us read the Hittites in their own words. They recorded treaties, laws, letters between kings, religious rituals, and even royal prayers in which kings begged the gods to lift plagues from their land. Few ancient peoples speak to us as directly. Hittite society was organized around the king, who was also the high priest and supreme judge. But his power was not absolute in the way an Egyptian pharaoh's was. Hittite kings ruled alongside a council of nobles and were bound by laws and customs. Their law code is notable for being comparatively practical and, in many cases, less harsh than those of their neighbors. Where some Mesopotamian codes demanded death for many offenses, Hittite law more often called for compensation and repayment, fines and restitution, rather than execution. They governed a diverse empire of many peoples and many gods, and rather than stamping out local religions, they absorbed them, eventually boasting of worshipping what they called the 1,000 gods of Hatti. Now, the Hittites are often described as the people who first brought iron weapons into the world, and this deserves a careful look because the popular version is misleading. The Hittites did work iron, and they were among the early peoples experimenting with smelting it. There even survives a letter from a Hittite king discussing the production of iron as something rare and valuable. But here is the key point that historians stress. Iron in the Hittite period was scarce, difficult to make well, and treated almost as a precious material, used for ceremonial or prestige objects, rather than for arming whole battalions. The Hittites did not conquer with iron swords. Like everyone else in the Bronze Age, including the Egyptians they fought, their armies relied overwhelmingly on bronze. The true age of iron weapons came later, after the Bronze Age world had already collapsed. So the Hittites are better understood not as iron warlords, but as early pioneers in working a metal whose real revolution would arrive only after they were gone. What the Hittites truly mastered was a different technology of war: the chariot. The light, fast war chariot, carrying a driver and a fighter, was the tank of the Bronze Age, and the Hittites fielded them in large numbers. This brings us back to the great clash at Kadesh against Egypt. Ramesses II, eager for glory, marched north and was nearly trapped by a Hittite chariot ambush. The Egyptian pharaoh later plastered the walls of his temples with carvings, claiming a magnificent victory. But the real outcome was a draw. Neither side could destroy the other. Years later, the two empires, exhausted and wary of the rising threats around them, signed a formal treaty of peace and alliance, agreeing to respect each other's borders and to support each other against enemies. That treaty survives, and it remains a landmark in the history of diplomacy, proof that even the ancient world understood that endless war between great powers could end in balance rather than conquest. For a time, the Hittites stood secure, one of the unshakable pillars of the Bronze Age order. And then, that entire order shattered. Around 1200 BCE, the whole eastern Mediterranean was swept by a wave of catastrophe, the same broad collapse that brought down the Mycenaeans of Greece and shook Egypt to its core. Cities across the region burned. Trade routes that carried the tin needed to make bronze were cut. Mysterious raiders, drought, famine, internal revolt, and the breakdown of long-distance trade all seem to have struck at once. The Hittite Empire, dependent on imported grain in its later years and stretched across difficult terrain, could not withstand it. Around 1178 BCE, the great capital of Hattusa was abandoned and burned. The Central Empire simply ceased to exist. The 1,000 gods of Hatti fell silent. But an empire's death is not always the death of its people. In the lands to the south and southeast, smaller kingdoms ruled by Hittite descendants survived for several more centuries, keeping the language, the gods, and the royal traditions alive. These so-called Neo-Hittite states carried the flame until they too were finally absorbed by the rising power of Assyria. And the memory of the Hittites, faint and garbled, lingered just long enough to be written into the pages of the Bible, a single thread left dangling, waiting for the archaeologists who would one day pull on it and unravel an entire lost world. There is a lesson buried in the Hittites that outlasts their walls. They were not remembered for the longest reign or the largest empire, but for a treaty, an agreement between two rivals who chose to stop killing each other. Of all the things a vanished people could leave behind, the Hittites left us a document about peace, and 3,000 years later, we hung a copy of it on the wall of the one place built to keep the nations of the world from war.